Welcome to Connecting Design Sprints with Agile Sprints. My name is Kjell Eldor Evans. It's a Norwegian name. That's why it's spelled like that. I'm Product and Innovation Lead at Manifesto. I'll tell you a little bit about us in a second. I thought the first time we've met, I'd just tell you a couple of things that I like and a couple of things that I dislike to give you a flavour of who I am before we dig into this talk. I really like learning by doing, getting on with the task at hand. Really sort of digging into the problems that we want to solve in our organisations. I also really like gin and tonic, and this afternoon will be a great opportunity to have a couple of those. I really hate analysis paralysis. Put your hands up if you've ever been subject to that, not being able to solve the problem. Is okay everywhere, yeah. That's something I really can't stand, probably because I like to learn by doing, right? I also don't like peanut butter, crunchy, smooth. Absolutely out. I know that's weird for some people. So I work for Manifesto, and we're an agency of creatives and technologists. The sales copy says that we inform and enable new experiences, products, and services that are designed around our clients' audiences and deliver positive change. So that's our wordy sales copy, but the bit that I'm into is the positive change bit here. I like to get on with it and figure out the ways that we can do that very quickly with our clients, rather than spending a lot of time on strategy projects that perhaps don't actually take us a step forward very quickly. These are some of the clients that we work with. So we've got a mixed bag, but most of the clients I work with are in the charity sector. So I've had a great time being able to work with the likes of Kew Gardens and being able to work with Stonewall and others. I'm going to give you a couple of case studies today of projects that we've ran to give you a flavour of some of the outcomes of the methodology that I'm going to take you through. So hopefully that'll be useful. And we'll take some questions at the end as well. Now, I've worked in-house and in agency, mainly on sort of product discovery, product definition projects. And sometimes, at least in my experience, it's felt a little bit like this. So this is actual footage of a prioritization session. So here are all the stakeholders just going for what they want, like really going for it. And over here, if you look closely, you might not be able to see it, but there's customers and staff members actually running away because the experience isn't what it should be. It feels a bit like a dangerous and sort of chaotic journey. I'm going to probably show something about myself now, but here's what I'd like it to be, a sort of very neat and orderly process. And I think we have the ability to run discovery processes that do look and feel a bit more like this. And if we reflect on the keynote this morning about linear or non-linear innovation, I think the linear story of setting a goal and putting a process in place to get you there and then evaluating if you've hit that goal or not is still useful in that more spirally view of what innovation looks like, which is a bit slightly in the unknown and not perhaps as neat. So I lead on Manifesto's Future Foundry, which is a sort of dedicated innovation unit within our agency. So most of the briefs that I'm working with are vague. You know, it's an opportunity that we're exploring. It's a new channel that we want to explore, or a new technology we want to make use of, or a new audience we want to engage with. And I'm going to take you through the design sprint method, the Google design sprint method that we often use to do that. I just want a quick show of hands as to how many of you have been part of a Google design sprint. Okay, just a few. Okay, that's good, because I'm going to share with you not only what it is, but also how I go around setting it up and a bit more of the kind of practical elements of how you might go around setting it up and using it and to what benefit within your respective organizations. But I thought I'd start by showing you a video of what a client says. It's just 2 minutes, just to give you a flavor of how these types of methods can really bring people together and actually be a lot of fun while solving problems. If you wouldn't mind, can you play that from here, or do I have to click it?
This is the very first time I've ever done anything like this as a hack day. Absolutely had no idea what was really going to happen and how the process was going to work, but it's been amazing. It's been so fast-paced, it's just been really focused.
A lot of energy, a lot of collaboration. We were sort of bouncing off each other within groups, but also between the groups as well. So yeah, a real success for me. The hack day had two principles behind it. The first one was really around collaboration. And the second one was really about bringing the expertise we have in the National Trust and our partner agencies and solve a real business problem.
I was keen to try and make sure that actually what was generated today came from a cross-section of people who had a heavy technical influence, and we wouldn't end today saying, great, thanks for your help everybody. We'd actually end today saying, here's what we're going to do next. Today's activities will have given an additional layer of ideas and ways to engage with our supporters in new ways.
This was really one of the first of hopefully many. The idea is we have these regularly. We bring people together, at least at the start of the project. So I think this is the way we solve big problems really from now on.
Kept hold of that quote. Used it quite a lot. So that gives you a flavour of Hack Day, which we had used. Let me just present this. As an initial process before we ran a design sprint. So the Hack Day, as you saw, was 40 people coming together to solve that one frame problem. I'll take you through how we do that in a minute. But we did that as a way to engage a very large group of people in the organisation who had a stake in this particular problem. We then used a more focused method to explore some of the outcomes of that Hack Day. So the result was there was one sort of leading idea that we then took through to a design sprint. This is an illustration of the Google Design Sprint. Some of you may be familiar with this book. We use a variation of Sprint, which was written by Jake Knapp. So the design sprint methodology came out of Google Ventures, was documented, and then this method is used very widely. We have adapted this for the way that we work, and I'm going to share with you the way we do it. But essentially, what we're doing is framing a problem, putting it through a 5-day process, and then ending that process, if we've proven that we're onto the right thing and it's tested well, with a backlog of features that we can go away and deliver. And I'll share with you exactly how we do that in a second. After we've produced our backlog of features, we can then run this through a Scrum process. So we are an Agile agency. We use Scrum for product development. What I'm doing during the design sprint is producing the product backlog, which we can then prioritize and take through into our 2-week sprint cycle, demo it to our clients, and then release it. So typically, we'd run a 1-week design sprint process, either to kind of design a core part of a product, or we'd run multiple design sprints to scale over different parts of a product over time and connect those two things together, the 1-week Google Design Sprint and the 2-week Scrum delivery, to build out a product and do so really, really quickly and really effectively. Now, I'm going to share with you an example of a recent project that we ran with the World Health Organization. So we worked with the World Health Organization to facilitate a design sprint over in the office in Geneva. They've got offices, obviously, all around the world. So we had to bring a group of stakeholders together to try and solve this problem. Now, this is my sort of general stance when it comes to a client brief. This is an actual footage of me responding to a client brief in the office of the day. If it hasn't got a problem statement, I ain't going to touch it, because I can't work with a defined process like the Google Design Sprint without having the confidence that we are all in agreement that we are solving the right problem and we have the right data and insight to support the solution design of that problem. And problem framing is the method that I use to flush this conversation out and get everybody in agreement. And it's pretty hard, but I'm going to show you what we do. There's many different variants of it. Some of them have been shared earlier on today. But I use this method, which references a person, so your audience member, what it is that they're feeling, what they're trying to do, the step they're trying to take, and the obstacle that's standing in their way. Now, this is like a bit like a haiku, right? So, you end with one neat statement, but actually to get there, it requires quite a lot of conversation. But for me, it is the most essential part of successful innovation, because if we start the process with a team of people who have a different idea about what this statement is, we are not going to end with something that everybody in the room feels is valuable. The other thing it gives us is a sense of where we might not have all of the information we need just yet to start the innovation, the design sprint process. We might produce this and realize, actually, we need to do a bit more research about, say, audience needs before we can enter into this process. So it's it's a sense check exercise, really. It's a sort of, we use it as a kick-off for a design sprint process, and sometimes we kick it off and say to the client, you're not actually ready to start. Quite frequently, actually, we say to the client, you need to do some more work yourselves or with us before we can actually enter into this process. Otherwise, we're not confident that the process will be a success. And that kind of speaks to a general attitude that many people, in my opinion, have about innovation processes, that, you know, they don't work, it's just a fun thing to do, it's an additional extra to our worlds. I think this is the method that gives us some faith that it's going to work. So this means, if we go through the process of problem framing, that we can reach that all-important consensus in the team as to what the problem is that we're trying to solve. It also means that we can interrogate the problem and prioritize it or them. So we might decide that we want to take some related problem statements into a design sprint. We might decide that some of them aren't as important to solve right now, so we can focus on the ones that are really going to deliver value. And we can even map problems over time. I haven't got a picture of it in here, but a sort of user journey map often will reference pain points. We can use problem framing statements within that to map out pain points over time or over certain jobs to be done across a user journey. So the problem statement for the World Health Organization example I wanted to share with you was an aid worker who feels pressured to act during disaster response needs complex guidance information from the World Health Organization, but can't find it. The information that we were working with is sort of very dense, heavy reports. In a crisis scenario, whilst traveling or perhaps not having a great internet connection, the aid workers were trying to find one really specific bit of information, but had to trawl through, find the PDF, download the PDF, and trawl through the PDF to find the bit of information that they needed. That was a problem. So we worked to solve that. The other side of this was the public element. So we worked with two statements in the one sprint. So this was the member of the public side of that problem. So I should say, member of the public who feels empathy towards a particular crisis, you know, perhaps has heard about it in the news and feels connected, needs some key information, but's overwhelmed then with all of the detail, you know, needs a bite-sized story really as to what's going on so that they can decide how they could perhaps act and contribute to helping. So what we did was we ran a design sprint process over in their office, their headquarters in Geneva, where we brought 10 different departments from around the world, and we worked with them for 3 days. I'll take you through the design sprint process end-to-end in a minute, but we spend 3 days typically with our clients, so with the stakeholder group on these design sprints. And what we produced was 5 toolkits that the World Health Organization could use, so modules and templates, that they could quickly put through a Scrum process, or prioritize it, and then deliver to the system, which they've done. I'll just show you some visuals of that. So we had a kind of hub, central hub, which was all about the sort of key crisis, and from that you could get snippets of information really, really quickly. We had a sort of long form and short form storytelling element to that for the kind of public member of the public audience, so that you could sort of feel connected to the story and find some of the sort of key stats that are really important. We produced sort of data visualization capability that they didn't have. All of this came out of 3 days with a group in the World Health Organization. And one of the participants who was in the group said to me, we've achieved more in this 3 days in relation to the website than I've managed to achieve in the past 10 years, because they're a very slow-moving organization, and it's hard for them to get together because of the nature of how distributed they are. And this is another example of how you then get into the sort of key underpinning report information that's related to that challenge. So that's an example of how we ran it with the World Health Organization. I just want to talk a bit more broadly about the methodology itself now, because that's an example of where we've created new components of an existing product, right? So their website existed, we created new modules. When we're looking at product innovation, we're interested in the whole scale of innovation, from incremental change right the way over to the sort of bolder, more radical change. So when we're running these design sprints, I'm equally as interested in the smaller kind of optimization lessons that we can learn from the process. equal to the bold new product idea that we might have. Because perhaps there's a small number of optimization insights that we could turn into stories and then produce that, when added together, deliver to the organization equal value to building out a whole new product. So we don't always jump immediately to let's knock it down and start again, but we're interested in doing both, because perhaps we can release some value now by focusing on some of these smaller changes, whilst we are describing the radical new product proposition that might change their organization. So we're interested in both ends of that scale, and I think that's worth noting. So the design sprint itself, how does it work? Well, we, on day one, spend time getting very inspired about the problem. So on the first day, we have lightning talks that bring in a number of different experts from the organization. So perhaps we are looking at audience research and insight. Perhaps we're looking at some strategic objectives. Perhaps if it's a specific type of challenge. Recently, I was working on a design sprint that had a sort of robotic automation question involved. So I brought a friend along who's an expert in robotic automation, and they came in and gave us some insights for us to use, and then they came back in at the end to review what we'd done. We spend a day getting really excited and bringing in sort of strategy and information in bite-sized chunks that we can work with by turning it into how might we statements. So we listen, we note down when we hear our colleague complaining about the fact that they can't get the information they need to the relevant support worker over in another country. We write down how might we unlock the stats from our PDF and present that in a neat form to our target audience. We have a whole load of these opportunity statements that we categorize and work with, and we take it through the process of ideation that I'll explain to you in a moment. So that's day one. On the second day, we look to competitors. What are other people doing out there? Are there any similar products that work very well that we can nick some ideas from, quite frankly? And that's a great part of the session, because it's really exciting to look at what else is out there and what works really well. We also like to look at related industries, so not necessarily would we be looking at information delivery through charities. In this case, we look to other industries and other forms of information delivery to get excited. And then we jump into sketching what a solution might look like. So we map out what the user journey, the target user journey is, the jobs to be done. And we just start sketching really quickly. That's day two. The third day is a bit trickier because people are knackered. There's quite a lot that's gone on in the first 2 days there. And there's a lot of sketching. There's a lot of energy as a facilitator. I'll talk more about that in a minute. That needs to go into moving people forward and focusing on the task and sticking to time. But on the third day, we're at a decision point. So we're deciding, we may have sketched a journey that's this big, but we're deciding which part of it we're going to focus on for testing and prototyping. So we'll choose a part of that we think perhaps has the most unknowns, or perhaps we think is the most complicated aspect for us to test, worth testing, in other words. So we choose that section, we storyboard out what a prototype might look like, and we make a plan for how we're going to prototype it. So what tool are we going to use? How are we going to test it with the audience? We answer questions like that. Then on day 4, for us, that's us back at base then. We've let all the stakeholders go home and rest after 3 days of talking. We produce wireframes, visual designs, and stitch together a prototype. And then on the final day, we test that with a target audience. So in just 5 days, we've gone from a problem statement to a tested prototype and learned a whole lot of things. We've learned that perhaps we were focusing on the people's idea of solution wasn't really what we needed. We've learned if the audience are interacting well with what we've produced or not. We've definitely got a sense as to what we need to do next. And if it's all gone well, if you've framed your problem well enough at the beginning, we end that week with test analysis and a backlog for delivery. I'm going to show you exactly what I use to play back to clients shortly, so you can see how I do that. But we end with a backlog that we could give and put through our Scrum process, and a delivery plan, so a roadmap. So we might identify some features that we perhaps don't think are necessary for MVP at this point in time, but we focus on what's most valuable and we can roadmap out what the rest of it looks like. And that happens in a week. So why use this process? Why do we love it so much at Future Foundry? Well, it does compress months of effort into a few days, particularly where the conversation is concerned, particularly when the brief is perhaps at the woollier end of the scale. It helps us really draw out that conversation and move and take a huge step forward very, very quickly. They are excellent tools for promoting buy-in from all of those people whose championship we rely on. So we can get the key people in the room, or their representatives, if they haven't had time to join. And we can make sure that they've contributed to the process and that their voice has been heard, crucially. Then when we launch the product and we're making some other asks of them to support it and produce content for it, and all of these things, they're a bit more likely to give it their time, in my experience, because they felt like they've played a part, because they have played a part, and we need them. I guess the most important part of all of this is we can deliver actionable insights very quickly. So I mentioned earlier that I'm not a fan of peanut butter or analysis paralysis. In a week, we can learn what we need to focus on and what we should perhaps avoid. And that's really, really key in developing new products. And it does reduce risk, although I'd argue that when we're perhaps selling this into senior groups, maybe it's still perceived as a bit of a fun, nice to have. But the reality is, the message we're trying to convey, is that you're reducing risk in spending months trying to describe a product that perhaps doesn't work or you don't need, or you're not solving the right problem. If we get to the end of the 5 days and we learn that actually the target user journey we focused on isn't working, and actually perhaps we had one case where we learned that it wasn't a problem and the users were quite happy with what was going on. It was an internal view that was a problem. That's good. We've saved them a hell of a lot of money. But the majority of the time what we're doing is taking a step forward in producing new products to release value. So how do we plan them? Because there's quite a lot. I've just given you like the quickest summary of those 3 days, and you know, it's documented in the books and things that you can read that some of you may have read, but the reality is a bit different. I read the book a while ago, picked it up, we started running it, and then I was like, bloody hell, this is hard. I wish I'd done a bit more planning. So this is how we approach that. There's specific roles within the process. So we've got the facilitator, and that's really important that, in my opinion, that the facilitator isn't a participant. There is a difference. We want the facilitator to lead the process, keep everything to time, keep everybody in check and awake, fed, the right temperature, all of these things, but not offering opinion. And I certainly really struggled with that when we were leading these, because I was desperate to give my personal opinion as to advise them, consult them as to what was going on. But that's not the job. You need to focus on keeping everybody on task, and that is valuable. There is a role within the book that we don't use in our process, which is the decider. The idea is at the decision point where we're using voting dots to perhaps pick the part of the user journey we're going to focus on. If there's a tie in the room, the decider, typically a senior stakeholder, could say, no, we're going to focus on this instead. But I feel that kind of distracts from the whole process, so we don't use it. We just get people to vote again and kind of tie them out until we get agreement, frankly. Then we've got sort of visiting experts to come in and do lightning talks. So this might be experts from around the organization who can't free themselves up for 3 days. Great, come in and share some of your insights with us. It might be experts from other organizations who relate to the challenge who can come and bring us some knowledge, and we want to bring them in. It's quite a weird gig for them because they kind of run into the room, talk for 5 or 10 minutes, and then you kick them out. So you've got to kind of tee it up well with them and make sure they know what to expect, or it can feel a bit strange. We've then got the core team. So these are people who we want in the room for 3 days and whose attention we demand. A bit more about that in a minute. And then we want to line up some test participants for day 5, which is a bit tricky because we might not know what it is we're producing or who is right for us to focus on. So typically, by the end of the first day, I'm spending some time figuring out how we might find some new people to test with. Also, this doesn't need to be consecutive. I'd say the 3 days do. But if you're going to do prototyping on Thursday and then test on Monday to give yourself a bit more time to organize it, that's absolutely fine. I think this is a framework to work with. It's not like there's not only one way of doing it. The other thing that's really important is setting the scope and structure of the process. So I mentioned problem framing. That's one way to do it. There's a couple of other things that I do before the session with the core group, before we get in the room, kind of to give myself a bit more faith that like I can work with them, that we are describing it well enough, and that there's no unforeseen problems. The first thing is to review the sprint goal, which might be a version of the problem statement or another goal that the team have come up with. Stick that on the wall and double check that that still stands. We also list out a number of sprint questions. So what are the things that we need, KPIs, I guess, for the sprint. What are the things that we need to answer and focus on in this sprint? So it's quite a long list, but the exercise allows me to say, oh, that thing you want to achieve isn't achievable in 5 days. So we have a conversation about that and figure it out. And we also want to plan what happens after the design sprint. Otherwise, it runs the risk of falling flat and have just been another workshop that people spent 3 days doing that didn't achieve anything. So I'm very much adamant that we always agree what's going to happen next with the lessons learned, like whose time is available, who's representing this internally. The second thing that we might need to do is gather some more research and insight. So we may have some user research and analytics, or we may not. If we don't, we want to go and get some. We may have some competitor research, or we want to get it. We might need to look at some related trends, and we definitely want to make sure we've got a sense of the strategic objectives of the organization or for the product. I like to find ways to package this and bring it into the room to visualize it. So I spend time creating assets that relate to these things that we can stick on the wall and refer to. If that's bringing in user personas that we can put on the wall, if that's cutting up a 37-page strategy document and picking out the key points that we can point at, I think that's, as a facilitator, a really important thing to do. The other thing that's important is setting the tone of the 3 days itself. So, I mean, some of that is like logistics. Where are you going to be? What space have you got? Do you need to hire some? How do you make sure that people aren't going to be distracted? So I never run these in the client's organization office. Never, ever. Because you run the risk of like their boss running in and asking them to do something which detracts them from the process. Let's remove people from their day-to-day. It doesn't mean that you couldn't do it in your own office, as long as you found ways to protect everybody. I also think it's really important to communicate what's going on to the core team, so they know what it is they need to be thinking about beforehand, and also to the wider organization, so that people can kind of get a sense as to why this is worthwhile. So one of the things that I do to ensure we do that is produce a pack, an information pack, 2 versions of it. A very detailed version that's going to the core team, and a sort of light touch headline version that we can send out to the wider organization to say, hey, this is going on over here. When I didn't do that the first time we ran it, and I realized that not everybody kind of knew why they were in the room or what we were doing when we got there. That wasn't great. I also realized that other people were like, what's this fun thing that they're doing? Why aren't I involved? It's important, I think, to position all of this really well. Then, as a facilitator, there's some things that I keep in mind as we're going on. The first one is ABC, always be capturing. So I want to make sure that if other people aren't writing stuff down, I'm always writing stuff down. Many post-it notes are harmed in the making of a design sprint. I want to capture as much as possible, and also use all of the space to illustrate what we're saying so that we can refer to it and point to it and bring it into the room. That's really essential. I work to contract participants at the beginning, and I don't care if people like it or not. I say to them, I ask permission. So I'll invite people to give me permission for us not to use our mobile phones, to step out and use them. Or I'll invite people to give me permission to sort of stop them if they're using their laptop in the room. And then I write our contracted terms on the wall. And I kind of, if someone's using their laptop, I just kind of go and stand by the poster that says, we'd agree that you weren't going to use your laptop, and sort of gently remind them. And this happens though, it's slow. gently remind them that we've got a contract. And that's really important because it gives me the confidence and the power to facilitate really well, and it means that we get the room focusing. And actually, it's a small point, but I found this quite transformational in the way that I facilitate, just getting people to be in the room. I create a deck that I use on the day so I don't get lost. With some examples of what we're producing and perhaps setting up some of the tasks and the agenda. And I sort of step through this deck on the day, which takes a bit of the pressure off me as a facilitator. I also use the agenda as a guideline. So I write it on a poster and I change it through the day if things change. Because we might need to spend more time on one part of the task than another. Or we might find that actually we need to look at a problem completely differently. And that's okay. The agenda's there as a guide and as something to use, but not necessarily for you to completely stick to. So then once we've gone through our 3-day process, there's lots of important kind of follow-up work to do. So I tend to summarize everything. I'm thinking, who are our audience? We've got the board to speak to, we've got the core team to speak to, and we've got everybody else. So I tend to summarize what we've done. This is an example in a short report, an executive summary of what we've achieved in the week. This will include the project brief and the goals that we had. I will summarize the methodology that we've used. You might notice some of this content from an earlier slide. I summarize what we've used it in why for the kind of senior stakeholder group. I go through every day and list out every exercise and just play back what the outcomes were. So just a write-up of the items that we produced. I send that back. I also illustrate anything we've produced while we've been there. So on the right there is a vision board. And on the other side there is the kind of flow for one of the design sprints we were working on. So on one side, we've got the audience. On the top, we've got the jobs to be done. And then we've got the features, essentially, that we would use to get them there. This is what we kind of designed during the sprint. I illustrate all of this so that it's there to be referred to again. This is the vision board I just mentioned. So it's one of the exercises that we use. It's not in the sprint book, but we start with a vision board for most of our projects, actually. So we start on one side there with the target audience group. So who are they? Then we list out what their specific needs are in relation to this challenge. We take that perhaps from the lightning talk information and any other insights we have. Then we think about what features we could bring in to serve their need. And we also then think about what value that creates for them and for the organization. So it just gives us a nice quick summary really as to where the room's at and what they think about the particular challenge and how we could solve it. And then we can kind of start ripping that up and playing with it as we go through the process. I also play back all of the exercises. So I'll put in, this is the gallery. It's my favorite exercise. After we've done Crazy 8 sketching, we put it all on the wall and vote on the elements of the features that we want to bring together to describe the product. But I play this all back in the report. And we end with a backlog. So I give the backlog to the client as well. That's the beginnings of one, really. Some epics there. And I play that back and say, this is the product that we've described. And this is how long it might take you to produce it. Just check time. OK. We also use user story mapping then to help us define what the MVP would be. So we might define a whole load of kind of features and stories that are that would take too much time to deliver, and we need to narrow that down a little bit. So we map a user story map and draw a line in that as to what's in our MVP, and everything below goes on the roadmap. That's typically a follow-up exercise that we run with our clients after a design sprint. So we've used it in many different contexts. This one I was just stepping you through the NSPCC sort of playback summary. We used it for the NSPCC to develop a new campaign for them. And interestingly, we weren't focusing in this case solely on the digital part of the campaign, so the landing page and the sign-up process. We began with a design sprint to actually design the proposition itself, the campaign itself. This is Childhood Day. The campaign is 30 days of play. So we use the sprint not just for pure digital product development, but also for campaign development. I just wanted to share with you some tools that have changed my life, which actually just means things that help me do stuff a lot quicker because I was spending a lot of time writing up these design sprints because, as you can imagine, there's a whole load of reams of information that's produced in 3 days, and it would take me a day or two to write it up, and that wasn't good. So there's a couple of tools that I think might help you do it should you want to go away and facilitate some of these yourself. The first one, has anyone heard of Post-it Plus? Did it change your life? It did. So Post-it Plus, if you are an Apple user, you can take a picture of a wall of Post-it notes and it will capture them all. Gone are the days of having to write them all up. It literally did change my life. You can organize them into different boards. I use this to play back all of the Post-it notes so I don't write them up. I just export the Post-its into, you can export it into a PowerPoint presentation, and I just play it all back that way. It takes me maybe 10 minutes to organize rather than, say, 4 hours. So it has changed my life, and it certainly helps for a design sprint where you are producing a lot of Post-it notes. The second thing is Otter AI. Have any of you used this? No? Changed my life. So Otter AI is useful for the lightning talk part of the process. So it's a bot that will listen to your audio recording and create a transcript, a really well put together transcript that's searchable. So you can search for a keyword, it will take you to the relevant part of what they said, and then you can play back the audio of that particular sentence. Or even as you play back the transcript, it highlights in blue each sentence that it's reading through. It really speeds up the analysis part of the lightning talks because I can't always remember everything that, say, 10 guests have come in and said, but I can quickly listen back to the audio and search for the keywords that I know are important and then pull out the kind of key statements that they gave as part of that process. And it's free. I just don't know what they're doing with the data. Yeah, I'm going to find that out. If anyone knows, let me know. The final tool is Miro. So this is useful. The illustrations that I showed you of the user journey map and et cetera in the report then were created using Miro. It used to be called Real-Time Board. They rebranded. I don't know why. You might be familiar with Real-Time Board. But it's an excellent way to sort of collaborate with other people who have been at the sprint remotely. So I can give them access, and we can start creating these assets and editing them together. I also use it to facilitate remote design sprints because it has voting capability. So we've been testing remote design sprints at the moment. So you can bring in video conferencing to it, and you can do all of the Post-it note voting things that you'd be doing in person remotely. So that's well worth checking out. This is a very important tool, the time timer. So yes, it's a clock, but it's more. It allows me to quickly glance and see I've got 40 minutes left. I've got no idea how long I've got left currently, actually. We're at okay. Well, I forgot to bring it. So as I'm facilitating, I can glance at that and see how long we've got left on the task. It just takes a bit of pressure off. It's definitely worth investing in. It's actually a clock that you carry around. Yeah, it's a little, about that big. They're mainly used for primary school teaching, but I find it really useful to use with the C-suite. So then we've got creating a 5-year digital roadmap. This is just another quick example I wanted to give you because we've used design sprints for campaign development. We've used design sprints for product development, but we've also used it for strategy creation. So I facilitated a 3-day design sprint with the National Trust where we brought a group of stakeholders together and mapped out what their 5-year digital roadmap looks like. I just wanted to put this in because I think there's a bit of a myth that this is only for product, but there's ways that you can create strategy quickly as well if you've got the right people in the room and you've got a clock. In this case, we had 25 stakeholders from around the National Trust. It was a big, big group. We had 3 days. We had a variation of this, and the output that we tested, the user testing, was of the roadmap. Do you agree with the items in this? Do you understand what it is, etc.? We did a roadshow of testing, and we got there really quickly. So it's useful in other contexts as well. This is a final example, which is ShelterBot. I just put it in because I quite like it. Will it play? It might start in a second. We ran a design sprint with Shelter to create a conversational interface for a child who found themselves homeless to find the right information. But this one was a 2-day sprint because we had a really well-defined problem. And what we did was mapped out this whole user journey, created this prototype. This was the output at the end of the week. And then we took it back into Shelter to figure out how we would do it in reality. In this case, it was really useful because we used it to flush out all of the legal kind of restrictions that we had, the sort of safeguarding elements to this. It enabled us to work first with the lawyers to figure out how we could implement this, which actually probably sped up the overall product development because we'd answered all of the most risky questions. Then when we went back in to say, right, this is what we want to do and this is how long we need, we had the answers in our pockets ready for the trickier questions that the board were quite rightly asking. How do I get to the next slide? So, to summarize, we've been using the design sprint process to quickly create a backlog of features, and we've been using all of these great tools and methods that we have available to us to get stakeholders to engage in this process. And then we have been using Scrum to deliver that backlog of features really, really quickly and see the results within the organization really, really quickly. Top tips, number one, use case studies to get buy-in for this process. So Lego use design sprints at scale. You can find really compelling case studies to convince people in your organization that this is worth time and investment. I feel it does take a lot of explaining if this is outside of your normal way of working. Understandably, people need to know why this is valuable. Number two, recut the process for your environment. 3 days might not work in your organization. You know, that's okay. Find another way to do it. It's the doing that's important and not necessarily sticking to the process as it's written. Definitely bring in the development team, so not just the product and UX people who are having a great time sketching. We want to know feasibility. We also want them to play a crucial part in the process because ultimately they're delivering it. So bring them in. Call on experts from your external network. If you can't get them to come in on the day, I mean, I just film people on my iPhone and then play them. It's still bringing their knowledge into the room, and that's still ultimately valuable. That's it from me.